Matt Walker discusses how sleep before learning aids memory formation.
It's not just enough to get a good night after you've been hitting the books. It's actually also important to get a good night before you hit the books. And that's sleep before learning being important. And then finally, I'll come on to some of our, I think, most interesting and exciting work, at least personally for me, which is looking at a new function of sleep, which is actually perhaps in regulating the emotional connections and systems within the brain and getting you ready to sort of face normal next day challenges. So firstly, sleep before learning. Do you need to get it? Is it important? Can you pull the all-nighter? Here's a study that we did to try and prove to them why it's not such a hot idea. You take two groups of participants. One's going to get a good night of sleep, the other's not. Both of them are awake across the first day, but then across the following night, those in the deprivation group are actually kept awake, whilst those in the sleep group get to sleep normally, a full 8 hours. And then both of them are awake across the second day. And then at the end of that second day, both of them perform a learning session on a computerized task, a memory encoding session, which I'll tell you more about in a second. But you'll notice that those in the deprivation group have accumulated approximately 38 hours of total sleep loss before they try and form new memories within the brain. And then we're going to test them on those memories to see how efficient that learning has been. But instead of testing them immediately afterwards, we actually wait until 2 full recovery nights of sleep before we test them, so that any measure of memory that we get is not sort of confounded by problems of bad alertness or concentration, etc. And the memory task that we used had a twist to it, and that twist was emotion, because it turns out that emotion, just like sleep, holds a very privileged relationship to memory. So, such that memories that are formed within an emotional context seem to be ingrained more strongly than neutral memories. And in fact, you all know this to be true. You just have to cast your minds back to those most distant memories. And if you do that, what you'll start to realize is that almost all of those memories are of an emotional nature. So, for example, we all have here ingrained in our memories those sort of horrific images of September the 11th or the space shuttle disaster. Now, it's not that these images contain any more or less informational content. They don't. It's that these pictures evocate emotions within us. And it's sort of that emotional milieu, so to speak, that wraps itself around the memory at the time of learning and red flags and prioritizes it for subsequent retention. Now, luckily, it's not just negative memories, it's also positive memories. So we actually started off in this experiment not using pictures, but actually using words. So during that initial encoding session, that initial learning session, subjects would see a series of words presented on the screen to them one at a time, which would either be positive, negative, or neutral in its meaning. And those words were all sort of jumbled up, intermixed. And then following those 2 nights of recovery sleep, we brought them back, and then we performed what's called a recognition memory test, which is where we show you all of the original words that you've seen, but together with a whole bunch of new words intermixed. And you have to try and pick apart the old words from the new words. It's not easy. But based on how accurately you're able to do that, we get a measure of how efficient your initial learning session has been. And so we just get old, new distinctions. That's how they respond on the computer. And that's exactly what you're looking at here on the sort of the vertical axis, the efficiency of learning, how good you are. The higher up you are, the better you are. Now, if you sort of collapse across those 3 emotional categories and you just look at those 2 groups head to head, what you find is that under conditions of sleep deprivation, there is a rather profound 40% deficit in the ability of the human brain to create and learn new information. To me, that's frightening, considering what we know is happening to sleep in our educational populations. And for any students out there, to put this in context for you, it's only the difference between acing the exam and failing it miserably. Now, if you split those, if you're interested, if you split those 3 categories apart, you actually see some interesting dissociations. If we just look at the control group first in green, those that have slept well the night before learning, what we see is just what many people have shown previously, which is that memories of an emotional nature, either positive or negative, are learned and persist more strongly than neutral memories. But if you look at the deprivation group, what you firstly see is the most profound learning deficits for positive memories and to a lesser degree neutral memories. And in fact, what you'll notice here is how much better those positive memories are in the control group who slept well relative to neutral memories. Yet in the sleep deprivation group, they're much more similar. It's almost as though the state of sleep deprivation completely obliterates any benefit that positive emotion normally sort of bestows on the learning process. But what was most interesting for us was the relative resistance of negative memories in the face of sleep deprivation. For me, the most interesting part of these results when we got them was that they actually may offer a novel learning and memory explanation for the high incidence of depression in sleep disorders. Because if you just look at these two memory profiles, when you've had a good night of sleep, that's what you sort of come away from the session with, a nice balanced mix of positive and negative memories. But when you haven't been sleeping well, that's the profile of memory that you get, this sort of skewed bias distribution towards remembering negative things over and above other things. Perhaps that's what you walk away from your day remembering when you haven't been sleeping well. Of course, the experience was nothing like that. It was equally positive and equally negative. But maybe this is the selective bias that sleep loss is causing.